we're pause. So perfect. So good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is the keynote address of this year's Global Negotiation Conference. For those of you, the participants or the wider public who don't know, the Global Negotiation Conference was established in order to, or with the belief that the negotiation, conflict resolution, that these tools were necessary not only on the interpersonal level, but also for political communities, both at the national and particularly at the international community, for prosperity, to strengthen institutions and to deepen cooperation. We're currently online, so we're in a virtual format because of the global pandemic situation, of course. But we are still hosted by the University of Zurich and the ETH Zurich. And I'll just hand over to my colleague, Professor Michael Ambul, who is the Chair of Negotiation and Conflict Management at ETH Zurich, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you very much, Jack. Good evening, everybody, and Labdien, Dr. Vike-Freiberga. It is my big pleasure, my honor to welcome you, the former president of Latvia. Our guest of honor was born in Riga, and to escape the Soviet occupation, her family fled the country. She studied psychology in Canada, where she earned a PhD from the University of McGill. And after 50 years of exile, she returned to Latvia to head the Latvian Institute in Riga. In 1999, she was elected president, and in her presidency, she played a very important, a leading role in achieving Latvia's membership in NATO and the EU. She published very many books and authored over 200 articles. She received numerous prizes and awards and holds 19 honorary doctorates. The guest of honor will speak of the role of political leadership in addressing global challenges. Madam President, we are very honored to have you with us. You have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ambul, and thank you for this opportunity to address your participants. Political leadership is something that differs somewhat from the kind of leadership in other fields that we may have. And it's a strange thing how in all of Eastern Europe, after the fall of the communist regimes, how frequently the countries newly liberated would turn to intellectual leaders, rectors of universities or well-known professors or public speakers and so on, to lead their countries, rather than following the path so well known in the West, where I know in Canada, when I arrived as a young immigrant of 16, it became very clear to me very quickly that, first of all, you had to be either French Canadian or English Canadian if you wanted to get anywhere in politics. And I'm talking about the second half of the 50s, and it was truly so. And secondly, everybody in politics seemed to have a law degree. And at that time, I was interested in medicine and biology and psychology. And frankly, it didn't attract me. It's not until when I sat in the president's chair and when we were accepted for negotiations for admission in December 1999 at the Helsinki summit, to start negotiating all the chapters of the acquis communautaire, that I discovered how complex and interesting law can be, considering that some weeks alone I had to sign as many as 300 bills, which meant some of them were international agreements that the union had undertaken over the years, and we had a lot of catching up to do. But what does it mean to be a leader? I think in terms of world events, we have to distinguish the personal qualities of a person occupying an office and the kind of chair they sit in. In other words, shall we confine ourselves to presidents and prime ministers? I was for 2 terms the president of the World Leadership Alliance Club de Madrid, and we had over 100 different leaders from all parts of the world. And obviously, I not only during my 8 years as president in all the United Nations General Assemblies and bilateral visits and so forth, I got to know them quite well. I got to know a lot of them from all over the world in the setting of the Club de Madrid, but also the Global Leadership Foundation. And maybe here is one point that I think is worth mentioning, that there are events in history which I doubt whether they would have happened in exactly the same way had a different leader been in place. And that's the first thing to note. The country and the setting, the power of the country, its resources, its weight in world affairs, all that has to be taken into consideration. You may be as brilliant as you like. If you're president of an unruly, undeveloped, and poor country, there's only so much you can hope to achieve, even in your whole lifetime. Circumstances will certainly cramp your style. And we just had a sad event just now on the news about the assassination of the president of Haiti. Both the Club de Madrid and the World Leadership Alliance of Club de Madrid and the Global Leadership Foundation had, over the years, made approaches to the leadership of Haiti. After the earthquake, the Americans put a great deal of effort into helping these people. But there's a country where the willingness of the popular climate, if you like, the traditions that they have developed, is extremely counterproductive and is constantly leading to both continued poverty, continued lack of development, and continued conflict and obviously violence as well. Whereas in the case of South Africa, which for many years had become a pariah in the international community, if F.W. de Klerk had not been the prime minister representing the white population, and if there had not been a leader such as Nelson Mandela representing the black one, I fear that the conflict might have been dragging out for far longer, and that the transition that was made, and which is obviously extremely complex and extremely difficult, would not have been possible at such low cost as it was. So that the investment of these 2 men in resolving a situation of absolutely brutal conflict of interest, brutal conflict of aspirations, and brutal past, if you like, differing paths, radically differing paths of the oppressors and the oppressed, for them to come together and to be able to negotiate and to come to a give and take situation where they were able, each of them, not just to accommodate their partner in dialogue, but to convince their followers that this was the right thing to do. And I think this is the 2 aspects of leadership that we must keep in mind. A leader must have convictions as to what is the long-term best interest for their country. They simply cannot afford to take a short-term view. And they do have, regularly, they do have to take on short-term pain for long-term gain. It is not possible to manage affairs otherwise. Because the world is very complex. Any country is made up of different interest groups, age groups, socioeconomic level, economic interests, you name it. These have to be accommodated so that the ability to negotiate, the ability to listen, as well as express the aspirations of the whole, that I think is crucial. And I think F.W. de Klerk, together with Nelson Mandela, to me, are a shining example of what is possible in saying, for the people of South Africa, negotiation and serious give and take, especially, of course, on the side of the whites, is the best answer in the long run. It will avoid bloodshed and great deal of suffering in the future. The fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, I had always prophesied, starting in the 1960s, when I started to be invited as a speaker to Latvian exile communities across the world, because these exile communities felt a sort of moral duty to remember their native country and to remind the whole world that it had been illegally occupied, that it had not voluntarily joined the Soviet Union, and that one day the Latvian nation was going to be free again, that we had this conviction, and we would be around, hopefully, to do something about it, and hopefully that it would happen without bloodshed. Most of my life, when I heard the arguments about, during the Cold War years, as to how could the world get rid of these communist dictatorships that were occupying half of the continent of Europe. I shall not talk about Asia and China and so on. It's a different kettle of fish, if you like. But let's stop there with the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain separating Europe in two. Most people in the West would say, well, you know, it's too bad. The Hungarians had the revolution. They lost a lot of blood. They lost a lot of population that managed to get into exile. They had been promised, it seemed, help from the West if they showed their desire to become independent of communist rule. They did not get any help. In 1968, Czechoslovakia rose up and demanded more freedoms, and tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia. It was not a free choice of the people of what is now the Czech Republic and Slovakia. It was a military imposed continuation of a regime which the majority of people had clearly rejected. So how was one going to go about changing this situation? When we look back as to what really did happen, because that's, of course, the best lesson, then, you know, in the future, we can all prognosticate, but who can prove me wrong about my prognostication, you know, until we wait 50 years to see what happens later. But the past we can analyze. And I think there were two elements. One, the people of the communist regimes, the majority of them, were quite aware of the absurdity of the ideology they had been forced to live under. And the majority understood, for instance, in East Germany, that their cousins and their brothers and their grandparents in West Germany had a completely different standard of living than in this workers' paradise, where supposedly everything was more equitable, everything belonged to everybody, and everybody should have been so much happier and content and living better. They did not. I had relatives in Latvia when I finally was able to come here and visit, still under Soviet rule. Well, first of all, when I landed in Leningrad airport, I and went to the train station to take the train to Latvia, I had ladies coming at me and wanting to buy my shoes and my stockings and my dress, and they were ready to undress me because it was, they felt that here was something new and fresh and fashionable, which you simply could not get. Everything was deficit. Whatever you wanted to buy, there wasn't enough of it. The whole system was economically completely absurd. The investment in the arms race and the investment in the race to the moon also cost the system. So that what I had prognosticated in this 18th of November, that's Latvia's Declaration of Independence in 1918, in my 18th of November speeches in Canada, in the United States, in Brazil, in Australia, I would say one day Latvia is going to be free. We have to keep believing in that because right is on our side. Our nation has a right to freedom and to independence, but nobody is going to go to have a nuclear war in order to give, or if you like, to answer to our desires. No, nor would it be responsible of us to say, you have to rise up and try and get rid of the system. For the size of the country with its resources and oppressive system, for a tiny country of 2 million, of course, it would have been absurd to try anything of that nature. And anybody who encouraged that would be, as in fact some British spies who were spying for the Soviet Union, they did after the war encourage the resistance movement. The so-called Forest Brothers were encouraged to keep fighting against the Red Army after the end of the war, with false promises that the Brits would come with parachutes and with boats and help them to get rid of the Soviet occupation. And all it meant is huge losses to the men who went into the forests, and also increasing numbers of mass deportations from the countryside, not just because they feared resistance to collectivization, but also because they were worried that people in the countryside would support any kind of armed uprising against the regime. It was irresponsible of these British officials who later turned out to be actually Soviet spies. That's the Cambridge group I'm talking about. They did a lot of harm and a lot of blood was shed because of their treachery. The system in the Soviet Union collapsed, but it had people who were ready to pick up the pieces to build something new on the rubble of a fallen empire. When I come to my country house, where I now spent the last year living because of the pandemic, I pass through a small town or a big village, as you wish, and I see this abandoned factory that's falling apart. And in my mind, I look at it and I say, here are the ruins of empire, because that hideous building, which nobody has somehow managed to get rid of, I sometimes say, I am going to blow it up, even if I have to sit in prison afterwards. It is an eyesore. It is a reminder of the tyranny that we suffered for 50 years. But these are the ruins of empire. And when an empire collapses, the people have to be ready to pick up the pieces and to build something new. In other words, there must be a basis of preparation for the change. And I think the sad thing that happened in many countries in Africa at the moment of decolonization is that the preparation, the fact that, say, the 3 Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, had been independent for 20 years before the Second World War, that they had their traditions of literature, of art, of ideological, if you like, a sense of what freedom can mean and independence can mean. I had a colleague at the Trust Fund for Victims of the International Criminal Court, where I served for 2 terms representing Eastern Europe. He was from the Congo and he was representing Africa. And Judge Bula Bula explained to me and to my colleagues that when the Belgians left the Belgian Congo, they were all of 3 university educated persons, Black persons, in the whole of the Belgian Congo. Clearly, in such a state of affairs, taking over the governance of a country was not going to be a smooth process, nor an equitable one, nor a peaceful one. And to this day, the problem has not really been solved. But the reason for that is different. It's the blood diamonds, it's the blood, if you like, all the subterranean riches of the Congolese territory that attracts so many armed groupings eager for the profits and the plunder of the riches of this huge country. That is a different story. But the leadership alone can give, I think, the direction. But the leadership cannot be one person alone. There are moments, as I say, historical moments, when you need individuals ready to step forward. Latvia had them when it confronted the Soviet Union, already starting in 1989, when it so-called rehabilitated its national flag and later its national anthem. It would send you to Siberia if you were caught having a flag in a house. So these are serious steps. There was a readiness in the population, and the leadership had been intellectual. In the times of oppression, it was poets who expressed the wishes of the people. But in order to have poets have, how do you call them today? Influencers, I think. I think the poets of the 1960s and 70s and 80s in Latvia and the artists were the influencers of their time. And the country will need such influencers. They will not be leaders in the sense of political leaders, but they will influence and prepare the population so that when individual leaders come with the individual skills and abilities to take over leadership and to follow a goal, such as in our case, for instance, when Latvia in 1995, just 4 years after the August coup, gave us de facto independence, the declaration came earlier. Latvia declared a goal. It wished to join the European Union and it wished to join NATO. Over the loud screams of protest of our neighbors in Russia and the leaders. As much President Yeltsin, with whom later I actually pinned the medal on his chest when he did come to Latvia, and we shared some vodka sitting on the shores of the Baltic at the residence during the sunset over the Baltic Sea. And Boris Yeltsin said to me, he put his arm around my shoulders and says, "Vaira, we're friends, aren't we?" And I said, "Boris, of course we're friends." He says, "Why do you oppress our people, the Russians, so much?" I said, "My dear fellow, we do not oppress our Russians. We love them. My one cousin is married to, I have 2 male cousins, both of them married to Russian girls. I have people in my chancellery whose mothers are Russian, whose wives are Russian, whose husbands are Russian. I say, we marry them. We do not oppress them. What more can you ask?" But President Yeltsin had been forbidden by his successor, whom he picked, President Putin, for 5 years to come and get that medal. And why did he get the medal? Because as a leader of the Russian Federation, who fortunately for us hated the guts of Mr. Gorbachev, he signed a paper renouncing forever ever the pretensions of the Russian Federation on Latvian independence. We had a peace treaty already forever and ever in 1920. But of course, that was, gone with the wind. Nobody would ever, Stalin never cared about treaties. Mind you, Trump neither did either. So, is not the only the tyrants are not the only ones who forget about treaties that their countries have been engaging in. But we have a council that decides on state decorations. President Yeltsin received the 3-star order because he signed an agreement that, yes, the Russian Federation recognized the renewal of independence of Latvia. But that took Latvian representatives to the higher Soviet in Moscow, who before the collapse, before the putsch and before the collapse, went before Gorbachev and said Latvia has declared its desire on the 4th of May 1990 to renew its independence, and Gorbachev yelled and screamed at them and threw them out and said, you're completely crazy, it's completely out of the question, you cannot do it. But they did that. They stood up and they walked through these hundreds of delegates at the Supreme Soviet to have the courage to say, that is what the Popular Front of Latvia has decided, you see. And for other countries facing different problems, of course, we must remember that what you need as a leader is a conviction about the goals that you have for your country, about the legitimacy of these goals, and exactly how you visualize them. For somebody who wishes to establish a dictatorship, obviously, they might be a brilliant leader and manage to establish a totalitarian system, and we have more than one. Quite close to us by the fact, authoritarian, or call it what you wish, but a system that is anything but democratic. And that's a different story. We could talk about what kind of qualities those kind of leaders need. But in democratic systems, or systems, if you like, trying to grow up to become more and more democratic, the leaders have to have this long-term vision. They must have an absolute conviction of the legitimacy of the aspirations of their people, and they must have the courage to stare down anybody who will question and refuse to acknowledge these fundamental rights. So it does take courage. You must have some warrior blood in you in order to be a leader, especially under times of stress, in times of transition, in times when you have to persuade your own people to follow a certain path, in terms of, because you want to have long-term goals you want to achieve. And at the same time, you must get allies. No country is an island, not even Great Britain. They can separate from the European Union all they want. They may have sea surrounding all their shores, but the fact of their links with the continent, they cannot erase them. You have to take into account the border context into which you are, and you have to accommodate to it. Of course, the accommodation can take a great many forms. We have a certain neighbor who considers that recently the site gave Mr. Putin a platform for expressing his views. I was rather shocked at this liberal attitude to very illiberal expression of goals and aims for Europe that Mr. Putin expressed. I noticed that he talked about the harm, the damage done to peaceful relations by the West, and especially NATO, threatening the security of Russia by advancing to its frontiers. And even not listening to what Russia has to say about former Soviet republics. Now, I would say that the very fact of giving a platform to such outrageously anti-democratic sentiments indicates on the part, as I considered it site, a really questionable lack of good taste, to say the least, about the matter. There are countries that have made their choice known. There are countries that have followed the path that their people have legitimately chosen. There are countries that have been accepted into the European Union and into the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance of their own will. We had a referendum about it. The population supported it. It is nobody else's business whether they live wherever, close to us or far from us. It is a business of those who become our allies. The countries, members of the then European Union, the 15 who voted, they had a say in it. Russia had nothing to say about it. It was none of their business. And my job as a president was to keep reminding that. And it was even worse for NATO. In this Die Zeit article, today in 2021, month of July, was it? Yes, it was beginning of July. Vladimir Putin is complaining that he was not consulted in the enlargement of NATO. It was done against his wishes. Well, too bad, pussycat, but frankly, it's none of your business. It was our choice and that of the member countries who made the choice. I had the chance of saying that at the Prague summit, and you can see the speech I made on the internet. I thank them all for the wisdom of their choice. I think we may be open for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your very passionate and very insightful talk there. I think Michael will be handling the Q&A. If anyone has a question, we'd ask you to put your hand up and then also open your video as well if you can. So Michael, I think you'll be going to people for questions.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Vike-Freiberga, for your brilliant and excellent speech. And I'll hand over now to the different people who would like to ask a question. The first one is Hanima, please.
Thank you, ma'am, for such an enlightening speech. My question is that as a leader, you must have encountered various situations in which you have to take a very tough decision without any assurance that it would lead to the right outcome. So in such a scenario, what would be your advice to aspiring leaders and negotiators to handle that kind of a situation, take tough decisions without any assurance? How do you suggest that we should go about in such a situation?
We never have certainty about the outcome of anything, whether that we decide individually or collectively. We have probabilities. And I think one thing that I think that every child should learn early in life, and I don't think it's done in our school systems, is learn probability theory. I mean, we learn the binomial theorem, but generally about probabilities. One has to be a bit of a gambler at some times. You have to take chances. You can't be certain of doing exactly the right thing. And it's worse than that sometimes. I can think of one, but I shan't go into the details if you'll forgive me, a situation where the government, in other words, I was president of a parliamentary republic. And in a parliamentary republic, the president represents the country and certainly, as in my case, can labor mightily in order to advance the interests of the country in international relations. But they have no say. I had veto power over bills, but I could not say anything about the budget. and in the things like foreign affairs and security defense, it had to be done always in concert with the executive branch of government. I did find myself once in a situation where the executive publicly announced a decision, and I had no choice. I had no choice but to back it up. Whereas, and for various reasons, it was something where, if you like, we were in the double-bind situation, and the country, in many ways, the country did not have a choice, much as it was not thrilled about the position that had to be taken. That happens too. In other words, when you make compromises in negotiating, you do sometimes have to acknowledge also that you can't be right 100% of the time. That's one thing. But worst of all, you can never please everybody. And that a leader must accept from the start. If you think everybody loves you, and sure, I was fortunate that I had this fantastic send-off. They sent me 1 million flowers and laid them out on a field and so on. And I couldn't ask for a better send-off. But there's some people who can't stand my guts. They don't like to look at me. I mean, it's obvious. I don't like everybody either, frankly. No, I tolerate them. I accept them, but I'm not thrilled about some of them. That's natural. So if you want to be a leader, well, you have to have courage. You must realize you may be attacked. You may be attacked physically. You may be like the poor president of Haiti or the president of India, Indira Gandhi. It happens. Periodically, it happens. You will be attacked. Your character will be, your reputation will be impugned and so on. One has to be ready for it, because that's part of openness and plurality of opinions. Somebody likes strawberries and somebody else likes raspberries, and you can't force them to love them if they say I hate them. Or like President Bush Sr., who said, I am president and I hate broccoli and I'm not going to eat broccoli. And it turned out that the broccoli growers of America got all in a terrible huff and said that as president, he had no right to say that he hates broccoli, if you please.
So, Michael, I think you need to unmute. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Very good example of the broccoli. Next question, Ali.
Yes, ma'am. It was an honor to have attended the presentation given by you, and also a privilege to be able to ask a direct question. My question is that for someone with your experience, if you're aware of the Kurdish situation in Iraq, what are the possible outcomes? If, for example, if you think about it, like in the near future, what would you, if you compare it to the Latvian situation with the Soviet Empire? Thank you.
I believe that the education in the broad sense of the word of the population plays a crucial role. And I don't mean learning the multiplication table or just literacy or even digital literacy and so on, but the spreading of certain ideas of what tolerance means. And tolerance, it can be a political slogan, but what does it rest on? Tolerance means on accepting you as a human being are exactly the same as I, intrinsically, from our birth. And by the way, this is one of the characteristics that good politicians and democratic politicians, they do have that. They are able to listen and to accept differences of opinion, including those who don't agree with them, but to accept and respect them and not immediately jump up on their high horse, especially not on their ideological horse, and start waving their sabers back and forth and ready to cut off the head of anybody who doesn't think the same way and have the same ideas. So in other words, an idea of the dignity and the worth of every individual life and the respect for their beliefs and their convictions. But, and philosophers since the ancient Greeks have been emphasizing, my freedom of choice, my freedom of action stops where your freedom of action starts. And in civilized society, why we have legal systems, why we have political systems, is that we can find a way, like a mosaic, of fitting. I have a tessellation here on my shirt. It's a sort of like a tessellation or like a mosaic, where you can put different elements together harmoniously, different colors, different shades, without harming or destroying any one of them. But if you have fanaticism and the idea that only your ideas are right and that you have to eliminate from the surface of the earth anybody who thinks differently, then I fear with such an attitude, there's going to be blood and it will continue to flow.
Nick, please. Nick, you have the floor.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ms. Freiberga. It was a very delightful speech, especially for me as a Russian. It was even more exciting to listen. And I have, well, let's say, two questions. Your skills in public speaking are something out there, like something which I've never perceived before from any other person. So how did you manage to develop these kind of skills? Probably the answer is going to be a lot of practice. And the other question is, which traits of your character brought you, or like the top 3, let's say, traits of your character brought you to where you are right now, or to your highest, where you have been throughout your life? I hope it makes sense.
Well, about the speaking, you know, when I went to high school in Casablanca, to my surprise, I discovered in my first term, as the teacher was reading off the exam results and saying, Amar, Aznar, Ben Amar, Poji, Poli, Rispoli, giving all the various 34th, 35th, 22nd, 18. I'm at the end of the alphabet. My name hasn't come up and I'm starting to worry. I wonder where on earth am I going to be? And I discover I'm the first and the best. And this happens in one subject and this happens in another and so on. But I spent 4 years in this Collège de Jeunes Filles de Mère Sultan in Casablanca. And except in a subject where we had elocution, French elocution as a subject under the French teachers, my teachers never asked me a single question because they wanted to catch out the students who hadn't done their homework, who didn't know the answers. And since I got such high marks, I was mute as a fish. I always got bad marks because I was chatting with my neighbors and that sort of thing. And then my mother had to sign a note saying that she had seen the complaints that I was talking in class and that sort of thing. But the teachers didn't ask me a thing. And the first time I appeared in public is because the Latvian community had organized for young people a sort of contest to liven things up. The exile Latvians in Canada and in the States would have a sort of a get together and a ball, a dance. In those days, one had more or less formal balls and that sort of thing, and also a contest of public speaking. And somebody of my acquaintance said, you know something? I have put your name down for that contest. And I said, what nonsense. I can't speak in public. I haven't even been speaking Latvian to anybody except my father and my mother, you know. for the past 6 years. How can I speak in public to a Latvian audience? And he says, yes, but when we chat with our neighbors, when we meet together, I noticed that you seem to have ideas. So I put your name down. So besides, I don't have any money to take a bus, and I can't get to, where was it, Niagara Falls from Toronto. He says, oh, I know this young man by the name of Vike-Freiberga, and he's just bought himself an old jalopy, and he will give us a ride. And so it started both a relationship with Vike-Freiberga, which is lasting to this day, and a career in speaking, which is also lasting to this day. I went there cold, and I won the contest. It just happened. And from then on, the ball kept rolling, of course. Increasingly, I gave lectures in summer seminars. As I say, we had song festivals, and I was invited to give patriotic speeches at the opening of song festivals. But when I look back on my life, there's of course the fact that I was a lecturer. I was a professor, and a professor has to explain things clearly. And I do believe, because I taught technically difficult, challenging subjects like psychopharmacology and psycholinguistics and cognitive theories and so on. When I had to explain to the Latvian people various difficult decisions that we had to take, I like to think that my experience as a good professor, I can honestly say I got jolly good ratings from my students as a good professor. And they said that many chose a career in science, either neuroscience or in the linguistic side, because they had enjoyed my lectures. So I think, yes, you're right, practice. It's, this idea of the 10,000 hours. I'm sure I must have put in 10,000 hours of public speaking. So go ahead, start adding them up. I think you can make it too.
Thank you very much. Keynote.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you, ma'am, for that lecture. Honestly, it was very enlightening coming from a completely different culture. The question I wanted to ask was that as a leader of the country, there are situations, I would say pretty much every situation, wherein any decision that you take has an impact internally in terms of the population of your own country, but also has an impact on the perception of your own country at an international stage, even if this concerns a very domestic decisions just concerning your country. So I want to understand from a leader's perspective that how do you balance the two in terms of managing the expectations of your own people and the perception of your country at the international stage? Thank you so much for your time.
That's an excellent question, because that is the main challenge of leadership. You have to persuade your own troops to follow you. See, it's not enough to wave the flag and to march ahead. You look behind and there's nobody there. You must, first of all, have a support in your own population. And that support doesn't fall from heaven necessarily. It's not spontaneous generation. It often takes argumentation, presenting data, emotional conviction, direct contact with people, gaining the trust of the people. I traveled to every district in Latvia in these 8 years of my presidency. I went to places where no politician ever had set foot before, for elections or anything else. Everywhere I went to old people's homes and to homes for the mentally retarded and so on and so forth, everywhere. So that gaining the trust of the people is one thing. But in relation to others, you have to do your best. I thought a historic interview on the BBC under a program called Hard Talk, where the Tim Sebastian at the time had established a reputation for really sort of nailing his interviewees to the wall. Well, I must say that halfway through the interview, I started seeing beads of sweat popping out on his forehead. And I realized that this boy was not going to nail me to the wall, but rather the other way around. And you know something? That particular episode, curiously enough, has disappeared from the archives of Art Doc. I tried to get it, couldn't.
Next is Belend Ismail.
Yes, thank you. Your speech was very insightful, and I just have a small question. So, what do you think helped the comparatively strong economic recovery after the collapse of the USSR and the Baltic state compared to the other Eastern Bloc countries, despite the hardship of the 90s?
The transition was hard. Big transitions like that. I mean, picking up the ruins. Germany, if you watch some chronicles of after the Second World War in Germany, where women were sent out by the occupying forces to pick up the rubble and brick by brick to clear the roads and so on. We had a collapsed economy. We had industries that had been deliberately built to be intertwined with the rest of the Soviet Union, with a deliberate intent to prevent us from continuing with these industries and preventing us from being independent. So that the population had to go through several years of really tightening the belts and several years of patience. Fortunately, we had a diaspora, which was very, very active in sending humanitarian aid. We had international organizations also that helped with humanitarian aid. And the people who were elected as leaders progressively went through and did the necessary reforms. We used to have a fantastic industry in the Soviet time, but it was a means of Russification of the country. In other words, a factory would be built, all the workers brought in from Russia, then their family brought in from the rest of the Soviet Union, if you like, not ethnic Russians, but Russian-speaking workers, and therefore diminishing the proportion of the Latvian population, with a very far-sighted thought that if someday something starts shaking up, and if supposing there was a referendum and so on, there wouldn't be enough Latvians left around. But this was one of the motivations for the Latvians in the 1980s, when they saw their numbers proportionately shrinking in the population, said that it's now or never, we have to do something. And they were ready, and they were patient, and the older generation is the one that suffered the most. But the young people who are now grown up, they're 30 years old, they've grown up in the independence, and they were babies at the time. And all they know is a free world with a pandemic. That's what they know.
Thank you very much, madam. I think we're coming to an end. We are all enlightened by the wisdom of your answers. It is very inspiring. The words of thanks are not pronounced by myself currently, but by Ines Sepa, who happens to be a doctoral student at my chair, and she is fluent in Latvian. Ines, you will speak in the beginning in Latvia, but then at the end you should switch to English.
Yes, indeed. I would like to say a few words closer to home. Lielas paldies, Prezidents Kundze, par to, ka jūs šovakar šajā karstajā vakarā dalījāties ar mums savā pieredzē. Thank you so much for your speech. We appreciate you for taking the time and for all the enriching lessons that I think were very valuable from somebody who on one hand has been a leader herself, and on the other hand has spent significant time reflecting on such important questions. And another aspect I would like to highlight is that we often hear speakers from large states And I think it was important and interesting to also hear the perspective of a speaker from a smaller country like Latvia, like Switzerland, on how to maneuver international relations when you don't always have a full say of your surroundings, how to stand up for your own values and needs, and how through that also somehow contribute to the global course of events. And if I may close with a last question on behalf of the young leader audience today, what would be your kind of words of wisdom for the people who will have a say in their respective fields a few years down the line, given the global challenges that we face today? What would you like to leave the people with?
I think faith in yourself is elementary in anything that you do. We have not all been blessed with parents who instilled in us self-confidence or super confidence. You see, parents can err both ways. If they spoil a child and say everything you do is wonderful, it hardly fits them for the competition of the real world. If you have parents who are too harsh, then there's a chance that the child will lose confidence in themselves. So I think you have to listen. All of us have an inner voice. We have an inner compass. So you have to learn to listen to your inner compass and to truly, I mean, this is a cliche which has been picked up by best-selling authors of self-help books, but I cannot, it still remains to be true that when there is something that you care about and something that you discover, sometimes you don't discover it, other people discover your talent. If you discover a talent that you're good at, develop it, work on it. Don't slouch, but do keep working, and you're bound. I guarantee, if you believe in yourself and if you work hard, you will get somewhere. You can't fail.
Thank you very much for this advice. I'm sure it's very valuable, especially for our young friends here. And then I'll give it back to our young leader, Jack, who will close the session.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you, Dr. Freiberga, for the inspiring speech. We really appreciate, again, you taking the time to address our conference. Usually at this point, we deliver or we'd go out for a meal, but unfortunately we can't do that. I don't know whether we could contact Ines to deliver some food if she's in the Latvian, if she's in Riga, or yeah, in the
I'm out in the countryside, so
okay. We'll have to extend an invitation to you in the future. Hopefully, when the pandemic is past, maybe there'll be a chance to have you with us in Zurich in person.
Thank you.
But thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed speaking to you, and I wish you all the fulfillment of your dreams. Do hold them dear, because they're your dreams, but also listen to those around you. Don't let yourself be pushed around, but listen to others. Sometimes they may point out something, for instance, about yourself that you hadn't discovered. So good luck.
Wonderful.
All the best to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for joining us, the participants, and those of you who are watching through YouTube. And we look forward to the conference will continue. For those of you who aren't familiar with the conference, please feel free to look at our website, get in touch if you're interested in becoming a member. It's www.global-negotiation.org. And we'd also like to just thank our hosts, the University of Zurich, ETH Zurich, the Europa Institute at the University of Zurich, and Stiftung MacArthur Schweiz. So thank you very much. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing the rest of the participants for the rest of the week.
Keep safe and keep healthy. Bye-bye.